They stopped the meeting mid-sentence and told her to leave the room, not because she had spoken, but because someone powerful decided she did not belong there. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut skin. Chairs froze. Pens hovered. The floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room reflected a city that kept moving indifferent, while inside a quiet woman was being erased in real time. Emily Parker stood near the wall, hands folded, shoulders slightly rounded, the way people learn to hold themselves when they have spent years being overlooked. She was not seated at the table. She never was. She stood close enough to hear far enough to be ignored. Until now. Emily, this discussion is above your scope, said Daniel Crow, the chief operations officer, without looking at her. His voice was calm, practiced, the voice of a man used to deciding who mattered. You can step out. No one objected. Not one person. Emily felt the heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears, not yet, but pressure. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She nodded once, polite, obedient, and turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, the large screen at the end of the room flickered. The foreign executive on the video call leaned forward, his face filling the frame, and spoke again in his native tongue. His voice dropped, measured, careful. The interpreter began translating, immediately smooth and confident. Emily stopped. It was not what the interpreter said. It was what he did not. A word hung in the air. One word. Old. Rare. A word Emily had not heard spoken aloud in years, not since her mother's kitchen, not since evenings filled with handwritten notes and whispered corrections. A word that did not mean delay, as the interpreter said. It meant fracture. It meant collapse by design. Emily's fingers tightened around the door handle. Her breath stalled halfway in. The room continued as if nothing had happened. Laptops clicked. Someone coughed. Daniel Crow was already speaking again, pushing the meeting forward, pushing toward a decision worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Emily let go of the handle. She stayed. The camera, if there were one, would have moved closer then. Not fast, slowly. The way truth approaches when no one is ready for it. Emily Parker was 36 years old. She had been hired 8 years earlier as a junior interpreter, fluent in multiple languages, including a regional dialect few Americans even knew existed. She had done well, too well, well enough to make others uncomfortable. When budgets tightened, her department was dissolved and she was reassigned to documentation support. A demotion disguised as efficiency. She had not complained. She never did. Her mother had taught her that silence could be armor, but also a prison. At the head of the table sat Richard Hale, the chief executive officer. 61 years old, silver at the temples, eyes sharp, restless, never fully still. He had built the company in an era when deals were sealed with handshakes and destroyed by lies whispered in foreign languages no one bothered to verify. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Richard did not look at Emily. Not yet. But something in his posture shifted. His shoulders pulled back a fraction. His gaze lingered on the screen longer than before. He heard the translation. He trusted the translation. But his instincts long buried under years of caution stirred. The foreign executive spoke again, softer this time. The interpreter smiled as he translated, his tone reassuring. Emily's stomach dropped. The words were wrong again. Worse this time, the meaning had been inverted, turned inside out. This was not a misunderstanding. This was choreography. Emily stepped forward before she could stop herself. One step, then another. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor was small, but it echoed louder than it should have. Daniel Crow turned sharply. His jaw tightened. "Emily," he said, warning in his voice now. "I asked you to leave." She met his eyes. For the first time. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "Sir." I believe the translation is incomplete. The room froze. The interpreter stiffened, a flicker of something dark crossing his face before he masked it. Daniel laughed once, short and sharp. That's not your role. Richard Hale raised a hand. It was a small gesture. Controlled. The room obeyed it instantly. What do you mean? Richard said, not looking at Daniel, his eyes still on Emily. Emily swallowed. Her heart hammered, but her mind was clear now. Clear in the way it only became when language was involved. The phrase he used, she said, nodding toward the screen, does not suggest a delay due to logistics. It implies a deliberate structural break. A planned failure point. The interpreter's smile cracked. That's incorrect, he said quickly. She must be confusing dialects. Emily shook her head. I am not. Her hands were shaking now, but she did not hide them. She had learned long ago that fear did not disappear when ignored. It only grew heavier. Richard leaned back in his chair. He studied her face, not with anger, but with something closer to recognition. How do you know that language? He asked. Emily hesitated. The answer was personal, dangerous. My mother was a community interpreter, she said. She taught it to me before I learned English grammar. Daniel scoffed. With all due respect, Richard, we can't derail a deal of this magnitude because of a support staffer's intuition. A murmur rippled around the table. Agreement, relief, the comfort of dismissing a complication. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, then again. The sound was deliberate, measured, a metronome counting down. Pause the meeting, he said. Daniel stared. Richard, I said pause. The screen went silent. The foreign executive leaned back, expression unreadable. Richard stood. The chair scraped softly behind him. He walked toward Emily, slow, unhurried, the way a man walks when he knows the room belongs to him. Stay, he said to her quietly. Not an order, a decision. Emily nodded. Her legs felt weak, but she stayed upright. No one knew it yet, but something fundamental had shifted. A crack had formed beneath a deal everyone thought was solid, and the person who felt it first was the one they had spent years pretending not to see. Outside, traffic surged. Inside, the air grew thin. The meeting would resume, the deal would move forward, but nothing that followed would unfold the way they expected. By the time the conference room doors closed again, the air inside felt thinner, like something essential had been siphoned out and replaced with tension. Richard Hale did not sit back down immediately. He stood at the head of the table, one hand resting on the polished wood, eyes lowered, listening to the quiet sounds people make when they pretend nothing has changed. A chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat. A pen rolled and stopped. Emily remained where she was standing near the wall. Her knees trembled now that the moment had passed, but she locked them in place. She had learned growing up that once you spoke, you stayed standing. You did not retreat, not if you wanted your words to matter. Daniel Crow leaned toward Richard, lowering his voice, though not enough. We're on a timeline, he said. The partners are waiting. This pause sends the wrong signal. Richard did not look at him. So does signing something we don't fully understand. The interpreter sat very still, hands folded neatly on the table, eyes fixed forward. His jaw was tight. Too tight. Emily noticed it immediately. She noticed everything now. The way his foot tapped once, then stopped. The way he did not meet her eyes again. Richard finally turned toward the screen. We're going to take a short recess, he said evenly. Stay connected. The foreign executive nodded once. His expression was polite, patient. But something cold flickered behind his eyes before the feed dimmed. When the screen went dark, the room exhaled. Daniel straightened. With respect, Richard, this is not how we handle high-level negotiations. We have legal teams, analysts, external consultants. We do not improvise based on... He gestured vaguely toward Emily without naming her. Richard's head snapped up. His gaze cut through the room. "You do not dismiss people without evidence," he said. "And you do not assume expertise lives only where it is labeled." Daniel held his ground, but a bead of sweat had appeared at his temple. "She's not cleared for this level of review." "Then that's my failure," Richard said, "not hers." The room went quiet again, not frozen this time, watchful. Richard turned to Emily. "You said the translation implies structural failure," he said. "Explain." Emily drew in a slow breath. She chose her words carefully, the way her mother had taught her. Not too fast, not defensive. "The phrase he used," she said, "is often misunderstood because it sounds procedural. But in this context, paired with the verb tense, he chose it, signals intent. It's a way of saying the delay is not accidental. It's designed to trigger a secondary clause later." "Secondary clause?" Richard repeated. "Yes," Emily said. "One that activates penalties on your side, not theirs." A low murmur rippled across the table. Someone leaned forward. Someone else frowned, recalculating. Daniel shook his head. "That's speculative." Emily met his gaze. "It would be," she said quietly, "if this were the first time." Richard's eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated. This was the edge. Step back now, or step fully into it. Her mother's voice surfaced uninvited, calm, and steady. "If you know something matters, you do not protect yourself by staying silent. You protect others by speaking clearly." "I've reviewed the background documents for this deal," Emily said, "and two others with the same parent company. The language pattern is consistent. Minor phrasing changes, deferred timelines, flexible interpretations. Each time the burden shifts downstream." Daniel scoffed again, but his voice lacked force. "And no one else caught this." "They weren't listening for it," Emily said. Richard turned away from the table and walked toward the windows. The city stretched below, gray and unbothered. He remembered another room, another deal, another interpreter whose words he had trusted because the process told him to. He remembered the fallout, the hearings, the nights staring at ceilings he could not afford to lose. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Daniel demanded. Emily did not flinch. "I tried," she said. 6 months ago, on a smaller contract. I flagged an inconsistency. It was routed back to Karen's office and closed. Daniel's mouth opened, then shut. Richard turned slowly. "Karen Whitmore." "Yes," Emily said. "She said it was outside my scope." The name hung there. Heavy. Karen was not in the room. She rarely was for negotiations this late in the process. She trusted her systems. She trusted the fact that no one questioned her. Richard nodded once. "All right," he said. "We do this properly." He looked around the table. "I want a parallel review. Quiet, internal, no alerts, no emails, no speculation." Daniel stiffened. "That will take time." Richard's gaze hardened. "Then we take the time." He turned to Emily again. "I want you involved." Daniel's head snapped up. "Richard!" "She stays," Richard said. "Final. If what she's saying is wrong, we lose a few hours. If she's right, we avoid something far worse." The interpreter shifted in his seat. Just slightly. Emily saw it. Richard noticed too. "Thank you," Emily said. It came out softer than she intended. Richard inclined his head, acknowledging it without ceremony. Then he turned to Daniel. "Get Thomas Reed from IT. I want access logs, version histories, everything tied to these documents. Off the record." Daniel frowned. "Thomas is weeks from retirement." "All the better," Richard said. "He remembers how systems used to be abused." Daniel hesitated, then nodded and stood, already pulling out his phone. The room began to move again. Quietly, purposefully. But underneath it, something else stirred. Unease. the sense that a routine had been interrupted and not everyone liked where that interruption might lead. Emily lowered herself into a chair for the first time since the meeting began. Her hands were cold. Her pulse had not slowed. She stared at the tabletop, tracing the grain with her eyes, grounding herself. Across from her, one of the senior analysts, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a stack of binders beside her chair, watched Emily closely. There was no hostility there, only curiosity, and something like respect. "You did good," the woman said quietly when no one else was listening. Emily nodded, unsure what to say. Praise made her uncomfortable. It always had. The door opened again. Daniel returned with Thomas Reed in tow. Thomas moved slowly, deliberately. His posture relaxed in the way of someone who had outlasted too many corporate storms to be rattled by another. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice calm, eyes scanning the room. Richard gestured toward Emily. She raised a concern about the translation integrity, he said. "I want to verify." Thomas's gaze lingered on Emily. Recognition flickered there. Not surprise. Recognition. That? So, he said. Emily met his eyes. Yes. Thomas nodded once. Wouldn't be the first time language hid something, he said. All right, let's take a look. As Thomas pulled a chair closer to the table and began asking for access credentials, Emily felt the weight of what she had done settle fully on her shoulders. This was no longer a moment. It was a process, a path she could not step off. Somewhere down the hall, Karen Whitmore was walking into her office, unaware that the first brick had just been loosened beneath her feet. And Emily Parker, the woman no one had thought important enough to listen to, sat quietly at the table where decisions were made, knowing that once truth entered a room, it never stayed contained. The first thing Thomas Reed noticed was not the data. It was the silence. The IT room sat 3 floors below the executive office's windowless, humming with the steady breath of servers that never slept. Fluorescent lights washed everything in a pale, unforgiving white. No art, no plaques, no glass walls, just racks, cables, and the quiet truth that every lie in the building eventually passed through this room. Emily stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped behind her back, as if afraid to touch anything. The door clicked shut behind them. The sound echoed longer than it should have. Thomas rolled his chair back and looked at her fully now. Up close, she looked smaller than she had in the conference room. Not weaker, just tightly contained, like someone who had learned to fold herself inward to survive. "You ever been down here before?" he asked. "No," Emily said. "We weren't allowed." Thomas gave a faint smile. "Funny how the places that matter most are always the ones nobody sees." He turned back to his monitors. 1 screen, then 2, then 6. He typed slowly, deliberately, the way men do when speed is no longer something they need to prove. Richard asked for document histories tied to the foreign contracts, Thomas said. "That means timestamps, edit logs, user credentials, access paths. You understand what you're asking for?" Emily nodded. "Yes." "And you understand what it costs if you're wrong?" "Yes." Thomas studied her again. "Not suspicious. Measuring. You don't sound like someone guessing." "I'm not," Emily said. "I just didn't have proof before." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "All right, then." He pulled up the first file. The original contract draft appeared on the screen, dense with clauses and sub-clauses, numbers spelled out in careful legal language. He clicked again. A timeline unfurled beside it. Dozens of edits. Hundreds even. Each one logged. Each one traceable. Thomas leaned closer. Here we go. He scrolled slowly. Dates. Times. Emily felt her pulse rise as patterns began to emerge. Edits clustered late at night. Not random. Intentional. The same user ID appeared again and again. Karen Whitmore. Emily's throat tightened. Seeing the name made everything heavier. Real. This was no longer interpretation. It was evidence. Notice the timing, Thomas said, tapping the screen with one finger. Edits made hours after meetings conclude, always after legal review signs off. That's not standard. Emily leaned in. What was changed? Thomas opened a comparison view. Red text bled across the screen. Deferred payment language. Arbitration venues shifted overseas. Penalty thresholds redefined in ways that looked harmless unless you knew exactly where to look. Emily closed her eyes briefly. This was worse than she thought. She didn't rewrite the contract, Thomas said. She nudged it. A word here. A phrase there. Death by precision. Emily swallowed. And no alerts triggered. Thomas shook his head. She had override privileges, granted years ago, back when Richard was cleaning up the last mess and wanted one point of control. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. Control. Trust. Fear masquerading as efficiency. Thomas pulled up another file, then another. You said this wasn't the first time. Emily nodded. The language patterns match. Thomas's jaw tightened. The metadata matches, too. They worked in silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that feels active charged. Screens filled with numbers, colored highlights, annotations. Emily's mind moved quickly now, translating not words, but intent. She could see it clearly. A strategy stretched over time. Slow enough to avoid notice. Consistent enough to be deliberate. Thomas leaned back. This goes back over a year. Emily looked at him. At least. Thomas rubbed a hand over his face. That means every deal touched by that office is compromised. Yes. He nodded once. Richard needs to see this. Before Emily could respond, the door opened. Karen Whitmore stepped inside without knocking. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. She wore a tailored navy blazer, hair immaculate expression, calm in the way of someone who believed herself untouchable. Her eyes flicked from Thomas to Emily, and something tightened at the corners. Well, Karen said lightly, this is cozy. Thomas did not stand. He did not greet her. He simply turned his chair slightly, blocking the main monitor from her view. Karen's smile held. Barely. Richard asked me to check on the status of the review, she said. I see we're involving support staff now. Emily felt her stomach clench, but she did not move. Thomas spoke before Emily could. We're verifying document integrity. Karen laughed softly. Integrity. That's a strong word. She stepped closer. Emily isn't it. You really should be careful. This kind of curiosity can be misunderstood. Emily met her gaze. Karen's eyes were sharp, assessing. But there was something else there now. Calculation. I'm doing my job, Emily said. Karen tilted her head. Your job is to assist, not interpret. Thomas's voice cut in. She was hired as an interpreter. Karen's eyes snapped to him. Was. Thomas's expression did not change. Language doesn't expire. Karen's smile vanished. You're overstepping, Thomas. Thomas shrugged. I'm retiring. The words landed harder than any accusation. Karen's pupils flared. Just for a second. I'll inform Richard, Karen said coolly. This is becoming a distraction. She turned and walked out without waiting for a response. The door shut with a controlled finality that did nothing to hide the crack beneath it. Emily exhaled shakily. She knows. Thomas nodded. She's known for a while. Emily looked at him. Why didn't you say anything before? Thomas stared at the monitors, the evidence glowing back at him. Because I didn't have someone willing to stand in the room and say it mattered. Emily felt the weight of that settle between them. Minutes later, Richard Hale entered the IT room. He moved slower than before, more carefully. His eyes went straight to the screens. Thomas stood. Emily did not. She stayed seated, grounding herself. "This is what we found," Thomas said. "No embellishment. No drama." Richard studied the data in silence. Long silence. The kind that stretches. His face did not betray him, but his breathing changed. Deeper. Heavier. "How long?" Richard asked. "Over a year," Thomas said. "At least." Richard closed his eyes. For a moment the room held nothing but the hum of servers and the distant echo of memory. He opened them again and looked at Emily. "You were right," he said. Emily did not smile. She felt no triumph, only a deep, steady resolve. Richard straightened. "We proceed carefully," he said. "No confrontation yet. No alerts. I want legal looped in quietly. I want financial tracing. And I want Karen unaware of the scope." Emily hesitated. "She's already suspicious." Richard nodded. "Then we move faster." He turned to Thomas. "You stay on this." Thomas nodded. "I will." Richard looked back at Emily. His voice softened just a fraction. "You did what no one else was willing to do." Emily met his eyes. "I listened." Richard held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned and left. When the door closed behind him, Emily sagged slightly in her chair. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Thomas watched her. "You understand," he said, "that once this moves upstairs, nothing stays quiet." Emily nodded. "I know. And you're ready for what comes next." Emily thought of her mother, of nights spent translating letters no one else wanted to read, of the cost of being precise in a world that preferred convenience. "Yes," she said. Above them, Karen Whitmore sat in her glass office, staring out at the city, replaying the moment in the IT room over and over. She had not lost control yet, but she could feel it slipping. And she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The quiet woman she had dismissed was no longer invisible, and that made her dangerous. Karen Whitmore did not sleep that night, and by dawn she had already decided who would pay for it. The city outside her apartment windows was still dark when she poured her first cup of coffee, black, untouched by sugar or cream. She stood barefoot on cold tile, staring at her reflection in the glass. Composed. Impeccable. The face the company trusted. But beneath it her thoughts moved fast, sharp, relentless. She replayed the IT room over and over. Thomas Reed's calm. Emily Parker's stillness. Richard's silence when Karen mentioned the review. Silence was never neutral. Silence meant something had shifted. By 8:30 in the morning, Karen was back in her office, heels clicking with purpose as she crossed the marble lobby. She greeted no one. She did not need to. Her office door closed behind her with a soft, airtight seal, and she immediately opened her laptop, fingers flying. Emails first. Not accusations, never accusations, framing, positioning, narrative. She drafted a message to Human Resources, carefully worded, professional, concerned. Subject line, procedural irregularities in documentation support. She referenced Emily Parker by name, only once buried halfway down, described as a well-meaning employee who had shown signs of confusion, stress, possible burnout. She attached no evidence. She did not need to. The seed was enough. Then she forwarded a second email to legal CCing Daniel Crow. She expressed concern about unauthorized access to contract metadata and potential exposure risks. Again, no names, just implications, just smoke. When she finished, Karen leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Control was not about force, it was about timing. Across the building, Emily Parker sat at her small desk, the one tucked against a wall near the copy room, the hum of machines constant and oddly comforting. She had barely slept either. Her body felt hollowed out, but her mind was alert, too alert, as if every nerve had been tuned tighter overnight. She watched as emails rolled in. Routine requests. Meeting invites she was no longer sure she belonged in. She kept working anyway, methodical, precise. She made copies. She labeled folders. She did not look at the clock. At 10:15, an HR representative appeared beside her desk. A woman in her early 40s with sympathetic eyes and a practiced smile. "Emily," she said softly, "could you come with me for a moment?" Emily stood. Her legs felt steady. She had expected this. Maybe not so soon, but she had expected it. The HR office smelled faintly of lavender and carpet cleaner. The door closed. The smile faded. "We've received concerns," the woman began, folding her hands on the desk, "about your recent conduct." Emily nodded. "I raised a professional concern during a meeting." "Yes," the woman said gently, "but it appears you accessed systems outside your authorization." "I did not," Emily said. "I was invited." The HR representative hesitated. "We're placing you on administrative leave pending review." Emily absorbed the words without reacting. Leave meant suspension without saying suspension. It meant distance. It meant isolation. "Is this disciplinary?" Emily asked. "No," the woman said quickly. "Not at this stage." Emily nodded again. "I understand." She gathered her bag and left without argument. As she walked through the lobby, she felt eyes on her. Not hostile, curious, the kind of attention she had never received before. She did not look up at Karen's office. Thomas Reed found out 20 minutes later. "They moved fast," he muttered, pacing the IT room. Too fast. Emily sat in the chair across from him, hands folded, posture straight. "She's trying to isolate me." Thomas nodded. "Classic move." "What happens now?" Emily asked. Thomas stopped pacing. He looked at her for a long moment. "Now," he said, "we stop pretending this is about procedure." At noon, Richard Hale received Karen's emails. He read them twice, then a third time. He did not react immediately. He never did. He called Daniel Crow into his office instead. Daniel arrived with a confident stride that faltered when he saw Richard's expression. "You approved HR action against Emily Parker," Richard said flatly. Daniel shifted. Karen raised concerns. "We needed to contain risk." "Contain," Richard repeated. "Or silence." Daniel stiffened. "Richard, this is becoming disruptive." Richard stood and moved toward the window. The city was bright now. Alive. He remembered another time he had been told to contain risk. Another time he had listened. "Bring Karen in," he said. Karen arrived 10 minutes later, composed as ever. She took the chair across from Richard, crossing her legs neatly. "You wanted to see me," she said. "Yes," Richard replied. "You placed Emily Parker on leave." Karen nodded. "She accessed systems she wasn't cleared for." "Thomas Reed invited her," Richard said. Karen's smile thinned. "Thomas is not in a position to make that call." "He was authorized by me," Richard said. The silence that followed was different from the one in the conference room, heavier, more dangerous. Karen adjusted her posture. "Richard," she said carefully, "you're letting emotion cloud your judgment." Richard turned fully toward her. His eyes were cold now. Clear. "No," he said. "I'm letting experience sharpen it." Karen held his gaze. "If you proceed down this path, you risk destabilizing the entire negotiation." "I risk that every time I trust the wrong person," Richard replied. Karen's composure cracked just slightly. "You're making a mistake." Richard nodded once. "So I've been told before." He pressed a button on his desk. "Have legal freeze all external communications related to the partnership," he said. "Effective immediately." Karen stood. "You can't." "I can," Richard said. "And I am." Karen left without another word. The door shut behind her with more force than she intended. By late afternoon, the building buzzed with quiet tension. Whispers traveled faster than emails. People sensed something coming. Something large. Emily sat in her apartment, the afternoon light slanting across the floor, her phone face down on the table. Bills lay stacked beside it. She stared at them without really seeing them. Her mother's old notebook rested open nearby pages, worn margins filled with careful notes. Emily traced a familiar phrase with her finger, grounding herself. Her phone vibrated. Thomas's name. "They've frozen the deal," he said without preamble. "Richard's digging in." Emily closed her eyes. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by fear. And Karen. She's not backing down. Emily inhaled slowly. Neither am I. That evening, Karen sat alone in her office, lights dimmed, city glowing beyond the glass. She made one final call, her voice low, controlled. Promises were made. Lines were crossed. Across the city, Emily stood by her window, watching the lights flicker on, feeling the weight of what she had set in motion. This was no longer about a single meeting or a single deal. It was about power, about truth, about who was allowed to speak and who was expected to disappear. And somewhere between those forces, the quiet interpreter prepared herself for the moment when silence would no longer protect anyone. The call came just after 9 in the evening, when the city outside Emily Parker's apartment had settled into a low, restless hum, and the lights across the street flickered like distant signals she could not yet read. She hesitated before answering. She already knew it would not be good news. Good news did not arrive at night, not like this. Emily Thomas Reed said, his voice tight, stripped of its usual calm. "We have a problem." She sat up straight on the edge of the couch. "What kind?" "The kind that doesn't leave fingerprints," he said. Karen moved faster than we expected. Emily closed her eyes. She pictured Karen Whitmore's office, the glass walls, the controlled smile. What did she do? "She didn't fight Richard directly," Thomas said. "She went around him. Legal just flagged something strange. A compliance inquiry. External." Emily's stomach dropped. "From where?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "Department of Commerce. Export Oversight. Someone filed a concern about improper access to foreign language materials. About you." For a moment, Emily could not speak. The words pressed against her chest, heavy and cold. "She reported me." "Not directly," Thomas said. "She never does anything directly. It's framed as a whistleblower tip. Anonymous. But the timing, the details, the language. It's her." Emily stood and walked to the window. Below, cars moved through intersections, obedient to signals they trusted. "What does that mean?" "It means federal eyes," Thomas said. "And once they're involved, Richard's hands are tied." Emily felt the familiar pull of self-doubt rise sharp and insistent. She had known this would happen. She had known speaking would cost something. She just had not known how wide the blast radius would be. "I didn't break any rules," she said. "I know," Thomas replied. "But rules can be bent to look broken." After they hung up, Emily remained standing by the window phone, heavy in her hand. Her mother's notebook lay open on the table behind her. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She knew every page by heart. Across the city, Karen Whitmore watched her reflection in the dark glass of her office window as she ended her own call. Her voice had been polite, concerned, patriotic even. She had used the right words. National interest, regulatory exposure, sensitive foreign language assets. She believed in precision. Precision always won. The next morning, the building felt different. Emily knew it the moment she stepped into the lobby to retrieve personal items she had left behind. The usual rhythm was gone. Conversations hushed when she passed. People did not avoid her exactly. They watched. The way people watch a storm form on the horizon, unsure whether it will reach them. Security escorted her upstairs. Not aggressively. Carefully. A formality wrapped in courtesy. On the executive floor, Richard Hale stood near the windows of his office, hands clasped behind his back, watching the city below. He had slept even less than Emily. His phone had not stopped vibrating since dawn. Legal. Board members. Government liaisons. He turned as Emily entered. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Do I have a choice?" Emily asked quietly. A corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not really. They sat across from each other, the desk between them wide and polished, a barrier that felt suddenly symbolic. Richard studied her face. She looked tired, not afraid. That mattered. "They've opened an inquiry," Richard said. "Unofficial, but real." Emily nodded. "Karen?" "Yes," Richard said. "And she's framed it as concern for the company, for the country." Emily looked down at her hands. "She's saying I'm a liability. She's saying language is a weapon," Richard replied, "and that you mishandled it." Emily met his gaze. "Did you believe her?" Richard did not answer immediately. He stood and walked toward the window again. Once he said finally, "I believed someone because the structure told me to, because the process said he was safe." Emily said nothing. Richard turned back. "I won't make that mistake again. But this complicates things." "Because now it's not internal," Emily said. "Yes." The door opened softly. Daniel Crow entered, his expression strained. "Legal is advising caution," he said. "They want to limit exposure." "Which means," Emily said, "cutting me loose." Daniel looked at her, uncomfortable. "It means distancing the company from the issue." Richard raised a hand. "It means we do nothing until we know exactly what Karen has set in motion." Daniel hesitated. "The board is nervous." "Good," Richard said. "They should be." After Daniel left, Richard turned back to Emily. "You understand what she's trying to do," he said. Emily nodded. "She wants to turn me into the problem so no one looks at the contracts." Richard's eyes hardened. "She's not just protecting herself." "No," Emily said. "She's accelerating." That afternoon, Thomas uncovered something that confirmed it. Emily was sitting in a quiet corner of the public library, laptop open, when her phone buzzed again. This time, Thomas did not bother with preamble. "She moved money," he said. "Recently." Emily's fingers tightened around the phone. "Where?" "Through a consulting firm in Delaware," Thomas said. "Shell structure, clean on the surface. But the timing lines up with the inquiry." Emily closed her eyes. "She's preparing to disappear, or to burn everything behind her," Thomas said, "including you." Emily stared at the rows of books around her. Stories, records, truths preserved in silence. "What do we do?" "We give Richard something bigger," Thomas said. "Something that shifts the narrative." That night, Emily did not go home. She stayed at the library until closing, then moved to a quiet diner across the street, nursing coffee she barely tasted. Her mother's notebook lay open beside her laptop, its worn pages catching the light. Emily cross-referenced phrases, clauses, patterns. She mapped intent across documents, not just words, but timing, behavior, absence. By 3 a.m, her eyes burned, but her mind was sharp. She saw it then. Not the fraud itself, the leverage. Karen had not just altered contracts. She had shaped risk, redirected it, pushed liabilities into areas that triggered regulatory scrutiny only if viewed from a certain angle, an angle she had now forced. Emily's breath caught. "That's it," she whispered. She typed quickly, assembling a timeline that did not accuse but revealed. A narrative that showed how Karen's actions had created the very exposure she now claimed to fear. At dawn, she sent it to Richard and Thomas. Richard read it in silence as the sun rose behind his office windows. He did not call her immediately. He read it again, then a third time. When he finally reached for his phone, his expression had changed. This was no longer about one employee being sacrificed to save a deal. This was about whether the company would survive telling the truth. Karen Whitmore arrived at the office later that morning to find her access partially restricted. Not revoked, delayed, subtle, the kind of thing that told her she was being watched. She smiled anyway as she walked down the hall, spine straight, heels steady. She had planned for this. She always planned for this. What she had not planned for was Emily Parker refusing to disappear. As the city outside surged into another day, two narratives raced toward each other. One built on control and erasure, the other on listening and precision. Only one would define what happened next. And for the first time, Karen Whitmore felt something she had not felt in years. Uncertainty. The notice arrived without warning, stamped urgent, marked confidential, and delivered to Richard Hale's desk before noon. He did not open it immediately. He let it sit there, heavy, deliberate, a white envelope that carried the weight of federal language and consequences no one could charm away. Outside his office, the executive floor hummed with forced normalcy. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. People pretended this was still an ordinary week. It was not. When Richard finally broke the seal, he read slowly. Every word, every implication. The inquiry was no longer theoretical. It named departments. It named timelines. It did not name Emily Parker, but it did not have to. The target was clear. So was the pressure. He closed his eyes and leaned back, feeling the familiar pull of old instincts. Contain. Control. Sacrifice, if necessary. Then he opened his eyes again. Down the street, Emily sat in the same diner as the night before, the smell of coffee and fried eggs clinging to her clothes. She had not slept. Not really. She had drifted in and out of shallow half-consciousness, her mind looping through documents and phrases, through patterns that refused to stay quiet. Thomas slid into the booth across from her, his shoulders tense, his eyes sharper than usual. "They're escalating," he said, quietly but fast. Emily nodded. "Karen won't wait." "She won't need to," Thomas said. "If the inquiry deepens, the board will want a clean narrative." Emily wrapped her hands around the mug in front of her. It had gone cold. "And I'm not clean." Thomas studied her. "You're precise." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's worse for people like her." They sat in silence for a moment. The diner door opened and closed. A man at the counter laughed too loudly. Life went on, unaware of the machinery grinding behind the scenes. "I need to be visible," Emily said finally. Thomas frowned. "That's dangerous." "So is being erased," she replied. Across the city, Karen Whitmore watched the board calendar populate with emergency sessions and legal briefings. She had expected resistance. She had planned for scrutiny. What unsettled her was the absence of panic. Richard Hale was not reacting the way he should have. He was not scrambling. He was not cutting losses. He was waiting. Karen opened a secure folder on her laptop and reviewed the contingency plans she had built over years. Offshore accounts, consulting agreements, redundancies layered so cleanly they looked like compliance. She had not survived in that building by improvising. Her phone buzzed. A message from an external contact. One line. "The window is narrowing." Karen exhaled slowly. Then she typed back. "Understood." Back in his office, Richard summoned Daniel Crow and the head of legal. The meeting was brief, focused, tense. "They want to interview staff," the legal counsel said. "Informally at first." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We can limit exposure." Richard shook his head. "We won't." Both men looked at him. "We're not going to obstruct," Richard continued. "We're not going to isolate one employee to protect the structure. That's how this starts to rot." Daniel hesitated. "The board won't like that." Richard leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. Then the board can listen. When the meeting ended, Richard remained alone, staring at the city again. He thought of Emily Parker standing near the wall, ignored until she spoke. He thought of how easy it would have been to let the system absorb her label, her a risk move on. He picked up the phone and dialed. Emily answered on the second ring. "I need you to come in," Richard said. "Not to the office. Somewhere neutral." There was a pause. "Is this a good idea?" "No," Richard said, "but it's the right one." They met in a small conference room at a law firm across the river. No logos, no glass walls, just a long table and muted light. Richard arrived first. Emily arrived 10 minutes later, her posture straight, her expression composed. "You don't look surprised," Richard said. "I expected this," Emily replied. He nodded. "They're circling." "Yes. I want to understand exactly what you found," Richard said. "Not the conclusion. The process." Emily took a breath. This was her language. Karen didn't just alter contracts, she said. She altered expectations. She reshaped risk so it appeared external, unavoidable. When the scrutiny arrived, it pointed away from her decisions and toward the people handling the language. Richard listened, still attentive. No interruptions. "She created a scenario where someone like me would always be blamed." Emily continued, "Because language is easy to accuse and hard to verify unless you know what to listen for." Richard leaned back. "And you do?" "Yes." There was a knock at the door. The firm's attorney stepped in briefly, left a file on the table, and exited without comment. Richard opened it. Bank traces, timelines, cross-references. He did not need to ask where they came from. "She's preparing an exit," he said quietly. Emily nodded. "Or a fire." Richard closed the file. "Then we changed the rules." That afternoon, Karen Whitmore received notice that the federal inquiry would include a formal interview. Not accusatory, not yet, but official. She smiled as she read it, but the smile did not reach her eyes. In her office, she began deleting files. Carefully, methodically. She believed in clean endings. What she did not see was the alert triggered by her activity, flagged by a system Thomas Reed had quietly adjusted weeks earlier. Thomas watched the logs populate in real time. He did not smile. He simply forwarded them. By evening, Richard had made his decision. He did not call a press conference. He did not issue a statement. He convened the board. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Voices were raised, objections made, warnings issued. When it ended, the room was quiet, in a way that meant something irreversible had occurred. Richard left without speaking to anyone. Karen sensed it the moment she stepped into the elevator and felt the weight shift beneath her feet. Control had never truly belonged to her. She had only borrowed it from a system that assumed silence meant safety. Emily returned home late that night, exhausted, her mind heavy with what was coming. She set her bag down and opened her mother's notebook one more time. On the last page, a phrase written in careful script caught her eye. She had read it 100 times, but tonight it landed differently. Precision is not softness, it is strength. Emily closed the book. Somewhere across the city, Karen Whitmore sat alone in her office, lights dimmed, staring at the door as if expecting it to open. And in a quiet building by the river, a decision had been made that would soon force everyone to listen. The boardroom filled before the sun had fully cleared the skyline, men and women taking their seats with the stiffness of people who already sensed the ground shifting beneath them. Richard Hale stood at the head of the table, not seated, not pacing, simply waiting. His presence alone slowed the room. Folders lay unopened. Coffee went untouched. No one joked. No one checked a phone. The air carried the weight of consequences. Karen Whitmore arrived last. She entered without apology, posture perfect, chin, lifted eyes calm. She wore gray neutral authoritative. She took her seat 2 chairs from Richard, close enough to be counted as trusted, far enough to avoid his shadow. Richard waited until the doors were closed. "We are here," he said evenly, "because this company is under federal inquiry." A ripple moved through the room. Not shock. Confirmation. Richard continued. "This inquiry concerns contract integrity, language compliance, and internal controls, specifically how risk was assessed, represented, and transferred." Karen folded her hands on the table. As head of international relations, she said smoothly, "I welcome transparency." Richard looked at her. Really looked at her. He had spent years seeing what he expected to see. He did not make that mistake now. "Then you won't object to us reviewing the sequence of events that led us here," he said. He nodded once toward the screen. The lights dimmed. The first slide appeared. A timeline. Clean. Clinical. Dates. Meetings. Edits. No accusations. Just facts. Emily Parker sat against the far wall, not at the table, not invited to speak. Yet. She felt the room tighten as the timeline progressed. She could feel Karen's attention like pressure against her skin, even without looking. Richard narrated without drama. Over the past 18 months, 42 contracts involving foreign partners passed through a single oversight channel. Each showed similar structural shifts, minor, precise, legally defensible. A board member leaned forward. "You're saying this was intentional?" Richard did not answer immediately. He gestured to the next slide. Edit logs filled the screen. Timestamps, user credentials, locations, late-night access patterns that told a story no language ever could. Karen's jaw tightened, just slightly. These changes, Richard said, occurred after legal sign-off. Outside standard protocol. Karen spoke, her voice calm. That authority was granted to ensure efficiency. "Yes," Richard said. "After Marcus Chen." The name hit the room like a dropped plate. Karen's eyes flicked up sharp. "That situation was resolved. Legally," Richard said. "Not structurally." He turned toward the far wall. "Emily." Every head turned. Emily stepped forward slowly, the sound of her footsteps loud in the silence. She did not rush. She did not apologize. She stopped a few feet from the table, hands relaxed at her sides. "Tell them," Richard said. Emily met the board's collective gaze. Some faces were skeptical, some curious. A few already knew. "The language shifts in these contracts are not random," she said. Her voice was steady, unadorned. "They align with specific regulatory triggers. The kind that redirect scrutiny away from decision-makers and toward interpreters and documentation staff." Karen laughed softly. "This is speculation." Emily did not look at her. "No," she said. "It's pattern recognition." She reached into her folder and handed a document to the nearest board member. "This clause appears benign in translation. In the original dialect, it carries a secondary implication, one that activates penalties only under federal review." The board member skimmed, then frowned. "Passed it along." Karen leaned forward. "You're accusing me of manipulating language." Emily turned to face her then. "I'm stating that language was manipulated," she said, "and that you were the only person with access, authority, and motive to do so." A murmur rose. Karen's composure cracked. "Motive," she repeated. "What motive would I have to harm the company I helped build?" Richard answered before Emily could. "Control." Karen looked at him sharply. "That's insulting." "No," Richard said. "It's familiar." He nodded to the screen again. Bank transfers appeared. Clean, layered, legal on the surface. But the timing told a different story. These consulting payments, Richard said, align precisely with the contract alterations. They increase when risk increases. Karen stood abruptly. "This is outrageous," Richard did not raise his voice. "Sit down." She hesitated, then sat. This inquiry did not begin because of a translation error. Richard continued. It began because someone listened closely enough to hear what others ignored. He looked at Emily, and because someone refused to disappear when told to. Karen's voice trembled now. "You're choosing her over me." Richard's expression softened, not with kindness, but with clarity. "I'm choosing the truth." The room fell silent. The board chair cleared her throat. "Richard," she said carefully, "what are you proposing?" A pause. Richard said, "Full cooperation, internal restructuring, language oversight removed from any single executive." Karen shook her head. "You can't do this." "I can?" Richard said. "And I am." He turned to the board. "Effective immediately. Karen Whitmore is placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal inquiry." Karen stared at him, disbelief flooding her features. "You're destroying me." Richard held her gaze. "You did that yourself." Security did not rush in. They did not need to. Karen stood slowly, dignity clinging to her like a shield, and gathered her things. As she passed Emily, she leaned in close. "You think this ends well for you?" she whispered. Emily met her eyes. "I think it ends honestly." Karen walked out. The doors closed. The room exhaled. Richard turned back to the board. "We have a chance," he said, "not to survive quietly, but to fix what we broke when we stopped listening." Emily returned to the wall, heart pounding, every nerve alive. She had spoken. She had been heard. And the cost of that was only beginning to reveal itself. Outside reporters were already gathering, drawn by leaks and instincts sharpened by years of watching power shift. Inside, a company stood on the edge of something irreversible. And for the first time, the quietest person in the room had changed its direction. By noon, the news had already escaped the building, seeping into the city through whispers, phone calls, and carefully worded messages that pretended not to be leaks. Emily Parker felt it before she saw it, the shift in air. The way people moved around her, now slower, cautious, like they were adjusting to a new gravity. She sat in a small conference room off the legal floor alone, hands folded on the table, waiting. Not summoned, not dismissed. Suspended in a space that felt deliberately neutral. Outside, the glass lawyers passed in measured strides. No one met her eyes. No one ignored her either. That was new. Her phone vibrated once. "Thomas, they're setting the narrative. Be careful what you say to anyone. This is the quiet part before the storm." Emily set the phone face down. She had learned the cost of speaking. She was learning the cost of silence, too. Across the building, Karen Whitmore sat in a private office. She no longer controlled her access badge, rendered useless by an invisible switch flipped somewhere deep in the system. She had been escorted out of the boardroom with courtesy, not force. That was the insult. Courtesy meant they believed they had already won. She stared at her reflection in the darkened screen of her laptop. The woman looking back at her was composed, calm. But behind her eyes, calculations raced. She had not survived this long without contingencies. Her phone rang. An unknown number. She answered without hesitation. "They moved sooner than expected," the voice on the other end said. Karen's lips tightened. Richard always did enjoy dramatic timing. "He's not acting alone." "No," Karen said quietly. "He's finally listening." The call ended. Karen stood and walked to the window. Below, reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras poised. She watched them with detached interest. Optics mattered. Truth was negotiable. She had always known that. Back in the conference room, Emily's waiting ended when the door opened and Richard Hale stepped inside. He closed it behind him. The room felt smaller immediately. "They're outside," Emily said without looking up. "Yes," Richard replied. He took the chair across from her. For the first time since this began, he looked tired. Not worn, not broken. Tired in the way men become when they stop pretending control is effortless. "I won't put you in front of them," he said. Not today. Emily nodded. Thank you. This won't stay internal, Richard continued. There will be hearings, statements, people who want a clean villain and a clean hero. Emily met his gaze. And we're neither. Richard's mouth curved faintly. No. We're inconvenient. He leaned back. Karen's counsel has already contacted ours. She's preparing to fight. Emily's chest tightened. On what grounds? Procedure. Authority. Intent, Richard said. She'll argue this was risk management, not manipulation. And the language. She'll call it interpretation. Emily exhaled slowly. Language is always the last thing people want to understand. Richard watched her. You knew this would get ugly. Yes. And you stayed. Yes. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. Richard broke it. When this is over, he said, nothing goes back to how it was. Emily nodded. It shouldn't. He studied her face, searching for something. Fear. Regret. Second thoughts. He found none of it. You don't see yourself as a whistleblower, he said. No, Emily replied. I see myself as a translator. Richard absorbed that. That may be the most dangerous role in the room. In the hours that followed, the company moved with deliberate restraint. No statements, no denials, just confirmations of cooperation. Reporters speculated, analysts guessed, stock prices trembled, then steadied. The market hated uncertainty, but it hated lies more. Emily left the building through a side exit at Richard's insistence. She walked several blocks before realizing her hands were shaking. The adrenaline had nowhere to go now. She ducked into a quiet park and sat on a bench, the city's noise muffled by trees and distance. She pulled her mother's notebook from her bag and opened it without thinking. The pages were worn, thin edges soft from years of use. She traced a line of script with her finger. Words are bridges, her mother had written, but only if someone is willing to cross. Emily closed the notebook and rested her hands on it, breathing until the shaking eased. Across town, Karen Whitmore stepped out of the building under a different kind of watch. No cameras yet, that would come. For now, there were only glances, the subtle distancing of people who sensed proximity to danger. She entered her car and sat there, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Anger flared, sharp and clean. Not at Richard, not at the board, at herself. She had underestimated one thing, not Emily's intelligence. That had been obvious in hindsight. She had underestimated her endurance. Quiet people, Karen had learned too late, often lasted longer than those who announced themselves. Karen reached for her phone and opened a file she had hoped never to use. It contained messages, recordings, fragments of conversations never meant to surface. Insurance. Leverage. She had collected it over years, piece by piece. If she was going down, she would not go alone. That evening, Emily's name appeared for the first time in an internal memo. Not as an accusation, not as a liability, as a contributor to an ongoing review. She read it twice. The language was careful, respectful. It did not praise her. It did not isolate her. It acknowledged her existence. That mattered more than she expected. Thomas called just after sunset. "She's not done," he said. "I know," Emily replied, "and neither are we." Emily looked out at the city lights, each one a window into a life unaware of the battle being fought over language, power, and truth. "I didn't do this to win," she said. Thomas paused. "Then, why did you do it?" "Because someone had to say what the words really meant," Emily said. "And because pretending not to hear them was worse." The line went quiet. Then Thomas said, "Get some rest. Tomorrow gets louder." After the call ended, Emily sat alone in her apartment, the silence thick but no longer suffocating. She felt exposed, seen, both terrified and grounded by it. Somewhere in the city, Karen Whitmore was preparing her Counter-Strike fingers, hovering over messages that could fracture alliances and muddy truths. Somewhere else, Richard Hale was drafting plans that would dismantle structures he had once believed protected him. And in the space between those forces, the interpreter who had been told to leave the room was no longer waiting. She was listening. And soon, everyone else would have to listen too. The first subpoena arrived before sunrise, slid under the door of Karen Whitmore's apartment like a quiet threat she could not negotiate with. She stood over it in bare feet, robe cinched tight, reading the header twice. Federal language, exacting. Unimpressed by narratives. She felt the old instinct rise sharp and practiced. Control the frame. Shape the story. Decide who speaks first. Across the city, Emily Parker woke to her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She did not answer it immediately. She lay still, listening to the building breathe, to the distant sound of traffic waking up to her own heart, finding a steadier rhythm than it had known in weeks. When she finally reached for the phone, there were 3 missed calls and 1 message from Richard. They've scheduled interviews. Voluntary at first. I need you prepared. Emily sat up. The room felt smaller than it had yesterday. Not suffocating, focused. She typed back a single line. I am. By mid-morning, the law firm's conference room was full. Not crowded. Precisely full. Attorneys lined one side of the table, laptops, open pens aligned. Across from them sat Richard Hale, posture, straight expression, unreadable. Emily took the seat beside him, not at the center, not hidden. Present. The lead investigator arrived last. A woman in her early 50s, gray streaks, pulled back tight eyes, sharp but not hostile. She did not shake hands. She nodded once and took her seat. Thank you for your cooperation, she said. This is an initial interview. Richard nodded. We understand. The investigator's gaze moved to Emily. You're the interpreter. Emily met her eyes. Yes. Explain your role, the investigator said. Emily took a breath. She did not rush. I interpret language. Not just words. Intent. Structure. Implication. A pen paused. That's a broad definition. It has to be, Emily said. Language hides in precision. The questions began simply. Background. Employment history. Training. Emily answered calmly, precisely correcting herself once when a detail mattered. The investigator noticed. Then the questions turned. You believe contracts were manipulated. I believe language was used to shift risk without changing appearance, Emily said. By whom? Emily hesitated. Not out of fear, out of accuracy. By someone with authority, access, and incentive. The investigator nodded. Ms. Whitmore. Emily did not say the name. She did not need to. When the interview ended, the investigator stood. This will continue, she said. There will be follow-ups. Richard rose as well. Will be available. After they left the room, emptied quickly. Lawyers spoke in low voices. Papers were gathered, plans adjusted. Emily remained seated for a moment, hands resting on the table, grounding herself. You did well, Richard said quietly. I told the truth, Emily replied. Yes, he said. That's rarer than people think. Outside, cameras waited. Not aggressively, patiently. Emily exited through a side door again, but she knew that would not last. Her name had already begun circulating in ways she could not control. Across town, Karen Whitmore sat in her attorney's office listening as her counsel spoke. Words like exposure timeline narrative. Karen nodded at the right moments, interjected when necessary. She did not interrupt. They're building a pattern, the attorney said. We need to disrupt it. Karen leaned back. I can do that. Be careful, the attorney warned. Anything you release can be used against you. Karen smiled thinly. So can anything I don't. She left the office and did not go home. She drove instead, the city blurring past, until she reached a quiet street lined with townhouses that all looked alike. She parked, cut the engine, and sat there, hands on the wheel, thinking. She pulled out her phone and opened a draft email she had written days ago but never sent. It contained attachments, selected, curated, messages that showed ambiguity, doubt, conversations taken out of sequence. It would muddy the water, not clear her, but confuse enough to buy time. Her finger hovered over send. In another part of the city, Emily sat at her kitchen table, her mother's notebook open beside her, the pages a comfort she had leaned on since childhood. She was marking passages now, not translating them, but remembering the way her mother had taught her to pause before speaking when stakes were high. Her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. She's going to leak something. Watch the news. Emily closed the notebook. Her shoulders squared. The story broke an hour later. Not clean, not accurate. Headlines spoke of internal disagreements, conflicting interpretations, overzealous staff. Emily's name appeared spelled correctly, framed as central but unclear. Emily read the article once, then again. She felt the old pull of invisibility tug at her, the instinct to shrink, to wait it out. She did not. She called Richard. She's reframing, Emily said. I know, Richard replied. We expected this. She's making it about interpretation versus authority. Richard paused. Then we make it about responsibility. That afternoon, Richard requested a second interview, this time with the board present. Not to defend, to clarify. Emily stood again in a room full of people who had once overlooked her. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She spoke as she always had, careful and exact. When language is treated as an accessory, she said it becomes a weapon. Not because it is sharp, but because it is ignored. A board member shifted uncomfortably. Another nodded slowly. Karen's leak did what Karen intended. It slowed the momentum. It introduced doubt. But it also did something she had not anticipated. It drew attention. Analysts began dissecting the contracts. Linguists weighed in. Retired diplomats spoke to reporters about the dangers of lazy translation. The story grew beyond the company, beyond the players. Language suddenly was the headline. That evening, Emily walked home through streets alive with sound. She felt exposed but not small. For the first time, she understood something her mother had tried to teach her for years. Being precise did not make you fragile. It made you difficult to erase. Karen Whitmore watched the coverage from her living room, the glow of the television reflecting off the glass. She saw her own words twisted, examined, questioned. She turned the volume down and sat in silence. Her phone buzzed. Another message from her attorney. They want another meeting. They have more. Karen closed her eyes. For the first time, uncertainty gave way to something else. Recognition. She had underestimated the consequences of being heard. And somewhere between the interviews and the headlines, the interpreter who had once been told to leave the room had changed the shape of the conversation itself. The hearing room was smaller than Emily had imagined, not the grand chamber she had pictured in sleepless moments, but a plain federal conference space with neutral walls, a long table, and the quiet authority of rules that did not bend for reputation. She sat at the end of the table, hands folded, posture straight, the weight of weeks pressing gently but firmly against her spine. Across from her sat investigators, attorneys, and observers who had spent their lives learning how to listen without reacting. The microphones were small. The flags were understated. Nothing about the room tried to impress anyone. It did not need to. Karen Whitmore sat 2 seats down, separated by protocol and consequence. She looked composed, but the sharp edge was gone. Her eyes no longer scanned the room for advantage. They stayed forward now, fixed on the table, as if control might return if she refused to look up. Richard Hale entered last and took his place behind Emily, not beside her, not in front of her. It was a subtle choice, but it mattered. He was not shielding her. He was standing witness. The lead investigator began without ceremony. This session concerns language integrity, contractual risk, and internal accountability. Her voice was even unyielding. We are not here to debate intent. We are here to establish responsibility. Emily listened. When it was her turn to speak, she did not rush. She spoke the way she always had, calmly, precisely letting silence do part of the work. Language is often treated as a tool, she said. But in complex systems, it becomes infrastructure. When it's altered, everything built on it shifts. A pen scratched. A recorder clicked softly. She explained the patterns again, not as accusations, but as sequences. How a clause changed meaning across dialects. How timing mattered more than phrasing. How risk had been redirected quietly, patiently over time. When Karen's attorney attempted to interrupt, the investigator raised a hand. Let her finish. Emily did. She did not look at Karen. She did not need to. The room listened. By the time the session ended, nothing dramatic had occurred. No outbursts, no confessions. Just a clear record laid carefully on the table, impossible to unsee. Outside, the sky had shifted to late afternoon light. Reporters waited, but the distance was kept. Statements would come later. Official ones. Measured ones. Emily stepped out into the quiet air and felt something release inside her. Not relief. Completion. Richard joined her on the steps. For a moment, neither spoke. The city moved around them, indifferent and constant. You didn't flinch, Richard said finally. Emily shook her head. There was nothing left to flinch from. He nodded. That room listens differently now. So will the company, Emily said. Richard turned to face her fully. The board has approved the restructuring. Emily met his gaze. And my role. Yes, he said. Not as a symbol, as a safeguard. She absorbed that. The words settled where fear once lived. Weeks later, Emily walked into an office that had not existed before. The sign on the door was simple. Language and Ethics Review. No name. No hierarchy implied. Just function. Inside the space was modest. A desk. A window. Shelves already filling with documents waiting to be understood. Her mother's notebook sat on the corner of the desk, its pages worn but steady. Thomas Reed stopped by that morning, coffee in hand, retirement finally official. Looks different from the server room, he said. Emily smiled. Still quiet. That's where the real work gets done, Thomas replied. The company did not return to normal. It changed. Slowly. Intentionally. Translation reviews became standard. No single executive held unchecked authority over language. Meetings took longer. Decisions felt heavier. But fewer people were surprised by consequences. Karen Whitmore's name faded from the headlines, replaced by process, by policy, by the unglamorous work of repair. She did not disappear. She faced what came next the way she had faced everything else. Upright, silent. One evening, as the city lights came on outside Emily's window, Richard stopped by her office. He did not knock. He did not need to. You were right about something, he said. Emily looked up. Only one thing. No, he said. About listening. I thought leadership meant deciding. I forgot it also meant hearing. She considered that. Most people forget. until they can't. Richard nodded. The company survived because someone refused to translate lies into comfort. Emily closed her mother's notebook gently. She taught me that. Later that night, Emily walked home at her usual pace, not faster, not slower. She passed people who would never know her name, never hear her story, never understand how close a system had come to breaking because no one listened closely enough. And that was fine. At home, she sat at the small table by the window, city noise drifting up from below. She thought of the first meeting, the door handle in her hand, the moment she chose not to leave the room. She thought of how small that choice had felt, how large it had become. The world did not change because she raised her voice. It changed because she used it carefully. If this story reminded you that truth often speaks quietly before it speaks loudly, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts in the comments below with 3 simple words: truth still matters.